The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello and welcome to the Macabre World podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Digati, and with me today is José Leitão, and he is talking to us from, are you in Coimbra, Portugal today?
Currently, yes. Coimbra, Portugal, yes.
Wonderful. José is an author, and he writes extensively, and a scholar as well, on different texts. And one of the, you can see his books on Amazon, the Coimbra Book of Saint Cyprian, also Clearing the Waters, the St Cyprian Divination, and Precious Apothecary, a Catholic Grimoire. And St Cyprian, also known among the Portuguese as St Cypriano, is something of a mystery. Tell us a little bit about what you write about, how you got into it, and where the significance is culturally.
Well, just throw me in the deep end.
Right in the deep end.
As we talked before, right? I'm doing a PhD right now in the history of Portuguese magic.
Okay, so Saint Cyprian, aka St Cypriano, who was he?
Well, the St Cyprian, when we talk about St Cyprian in relation to magic and magic books, we're talking about St Cyprian of Antioch, who is essentially a fictional character from the 4th century. There's like 3 texts around the same time period. 2 might have the same author, the 3rd probably not, which is the Confession of Cyprian and Conversion of Cyprian and the Martyrdom of Cyprian. And they tell this story about this pagan sorcerer who was a professional sorcerer. So he was hired by people to do things. And he was hired to make a certain Christian virgin fall in love with one of his clients. And he attempted to summon all the spirits that he knew about and he worked with. Obviously, it's written from a Christian perspective, so they go straight to saying that he summoned the devil to get this woman to fall in love with his client. He ends up not being able to do this, and he's not able to because she is a Christian, and Christianity is inherently superior to these pagan magical practices. And so he ends up converting to Christianity and being martyred. Now, obviously, like I said, this is a fictional narrative. It's essentially a story of religious polemics, something that people in the 4th century would write. And there are several stories like this, these narratives that basically try to frame paganism as inherently inferior to Christianity, this new booming religion that claims to be the know-all and all of cosmology. So that's basically it in terms of who St. Cyprian is, in terms of a literary character. Now, how this then, obviously, the story has a thematic of magic, so that people would eventually refer to St. Cyprian as a patron saint against magic is pretty straightforward. St. Cyprian and Justina, who was the woman that he was trying to seduce, who also becomes a saint. But then you also have that an ambiguity appears that apparently is St. Cyprian, and we have reports of this at least in Portugal as early as the 16th century. St. Cyprian starts to be petitioned to aid in the practice of magic also, for reasons I actually can't tell. You just start seeing texts and incantations and magic practices that all of a sudden start calling about St. Cyprian.
Which is unusual. Now, in present day, Portugal is largely, while it's very cosmopolitan now, it was largely a Roman Catholic country throughout the Middle Ages and to present day. That is the predominant religious practice, is it not?
Yeah, in the broad sense. Yeah, I'll say so. Yeah, sure.
I mean, there are different there, and of course, there's it's a, like I said, it's a very cosmopolitan place now. It has,
Mm,
just like many other modern countries with big cities, you get a little bit of everybody. But historically, it is a Catholic country,
correct.
more or less. And so the practice of magic, and I know in modern day that like you had said, the narrative is that magic is inferior, magic is the old way, the bad way, and often associated with the dark arts, and that the Christianity is the new way. So therefore all things having to do with the darkness are bad. These texts, so if he was a fictional character, where did these texts come from?
The ones currently attributed to Cyprian?
Yes.
That's a bit of a mystery still. As early as the 17th century, the first mention I have found of somebody talking of an object that is referred to as a Book of Saint Cyprian as being a book of magic is 1621. It's an Inquisition trial. And the individual who supposedly had this book claims to have owned it for about 30 years. So it's late 16th century. That's the first time that the name Book of St. Cyprian shows up.
And in this book that is at this point, and I hasten to say, not unlike many religious texts that over the centuries get edited and diversified and they change and ebb and flow, but this book contained spells, rituals of magic.
The description that's given of it seems to place it mostly as a collection of, you would call them magic rituals, sure, but mostly focused on issues of healing and the removal of the evil eye or the removal of an evil spirit. And the reason why this book appears to be called Book of St. Cyprian and how that title, what causes the book to be given that title, seems to be that this book had, among the several procedures that it contained, something called the Prayer of St. Cyprian, which is a pretty old prayer too. Nobody knows where it came from. There are several versions of it all over Europe. You even have Arabic versions of the Prayer of St. Cyprian. And it's basically, it's a very lengthy prayer, and it basically retells the tale of St. Cyprian, and it's used as a banishment for evil spirits and evil eye. And what seems to happen in Portugal is that any book that will contain eventually this prayer on its pages starts getting referred to as a Book of St. Cyprian. So that is the one point that originally frames this title. Then all sorts of other elements start to be added to this, magical procedures for healing, eventually to find treasure, and a whole bunch of things. So you have a great variety of books calling themselves Books of St. Cyprian, but the only thing they have in common, besides the title, is that they all have the Prayer of St. Cyprian in them.
So it's definitely gotten commercialized, and it's become many things.
Yeah, this is throughout like the early modern period, 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Then you cannot say that there is one Book of St. Cyprian during that period. It's a great variety of them. When you get to the 19th century with the printing press, then this does become crystallized in a mostly stable form, which you can call it a commercial object, which is basically the same book we still have today. Which today, if you go to a bookstore and you ask for a Book of St. Cyprian, you will get a 19th century book.
I want to say the one I have, I should have brought it up, is there. O Grand Livro do St Cyprian is meaning, one I have is in Portuguese, but it's a modern book, and it's the great book of St. Cyprian, I think, the
Right.
Wizard, or I is the rough translation.
That's a 19th century book.
Right. It is a more modern text. How close is that to anything that existed? Is it somewhat reminiscent? The prayer part, at least, maybe?
The prayer part is pretty similar. The prayer, I have prayers as early as the 16th century. They are pretty stable. Since it's very lengthy, there are sections which sometimes might have some alterations, but the overall structure maintains itself throughout time pretty well, and throughout geography. This older version I have is pretty similar. It's more similar to a Scandinavian contemporary version than the one found in the book. So it's just this really big thing that just exists.
And folks can find, your writings again. They should go on Amazon and look up. Your first name is José. For folks who are not familiar with Portuguese names, José looks just like what you would know as Jose, and it's Leitão, Leitao. And if you look him up on Amazon and also on YouTube, you can hear lectures and they can get a look at your books. But you've gone into this very deeply in your writing.
Yeah. Are we done with the previous question? I feel like there was something still.
Oh, well, I'm trying. I guess I'm trying to figure out like how the book that I have, what does it relate? How much in it is related to the original concept?
Only the prayer. Everything else, but it's when I say that the book is a 19th century creation, it doesn't mean that all of its content came from the 19th century, because everything came from somewhere. And you have stuff in there, the contemporary book. You have early modern urban folk magic, which is a topic I'm really exploring these days, which is this consistent, apparently consistent form of non-bookish, non-learned magic, something that's just transmitted orally.
Yes, oral tradition.
But that existed. You tend to think about folk magic in terms of more rural environments, but there is a folk magic that happens in cities, and you find this style of magic consistently throughout centuries in Portuguese and Spanish urban centers, and eventually in South America. So there's a lot of that in the contemporary Book of St Cyprian. There are procedures that are taken from rural folk magic also, and then there are bits and pieces that have been collected from 17th century erudite sources, Baroque authors on spirituality, and then you have 19th century occultism, like more on the theosophical side of things, and all of these things get clumped together, and that's what makes up this 19th century object.
Folk magic is alive and well in Portugal and in many parts of the world.
Anywhere. Sure,
but
yeah.
Specifically, well, I'm just coming. My grandmother, my grandmother was born in 1893, and she's a little old to be my grandmother, but she was born in 1893, and she died when I was young. But I knew her and remember her well, and she came to the United States in 1909. But she was originally from the island of Terceira. She was from a little village on the north side called Biscoites, and she was very much into folk magic. And I think a lot of the people who grew up in the area of New England where I grew up, because there's a big Azorian population there and lots of Portuguese folks, is we always used to call it the Fitzeira stuff. Anytime somebody was gonna what's the matter? We're gonna do Vavá Fitzeira stuff, because the grandmother. Well, it was in addition to anything that made sense. There were things that didn't make sense that you did, like when you were talking, and folks can't see because whenever you said evil eye, my Aunt Terry always put up what she called the figa.
Yes,
the figa, which is if folks look that up, it's basically a fist with your thumb sticking through your index and ring finger and middle finger, and and it's like the ward off the evil eye kind of thing. Yeah. I remember if you had a sty, I had to rub gold on it. I mean, this is crazy stuff.
Most people don't know this. The figa, that's basically the female equivalent of giving somebody the finger. It simulates vagina.
Fantastic.
Yes, so people should use that more. It's good.
Yeah, well, it's now that I'm starting to think about, like, the next time somebody gives me the finger, I'm gonna have to work that in. I think that would be a proper response. Somebody gives you the finger. Oh, well, yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
maybe. I live in New Jersey. The finger's very popular, especially while you're driving. But I grew up with crazy folk traditions, and I say crazy folk traditions, and I have a lot of respect for them, even though I think they sound crazy to other people. I mean, when you want to sell a house, you're going to bury St. Joseph upside down in your yard. When you have a sty in your eye, or probably they used to rub gold on it. They always say, get a piece of Portuguese gold. They usually, I think she had like an escudo, the gold coin.
Yeah.
And put that on the thing. I don't know what that does. I don't know if these things go away on their own and it just helps you deal with them in the meantime. But it was all very real, because there were teas and herbal preparations. But now that's scientific in itself. But there's a lot of this interwoven into even modern culture, even though the family may be Christian, even though there's a lot of these traditions that date back pre-Christian, I think, that are still part of the culture.
Yeah, look, you can call them pre-Christian, sure, which is true. But it's just a matter, first of all, it's, again, things don't just come out of nowhere. Everything has a continuity. So if you're going to call a particular item of folk magic to be pre-Christian, then everything is pre-Christian.
Well,
even Christianity is pre-Christian.
True, very true. Stand corrected. You are quite right. But I mean, these are long-standing. These are woven into the culture, and
they're woven into just the human experience. And this is an issue which is, you're bringing up, which are pretty academic points of discussion from my perspective. And this is when you talk about magic and you talk about religion or you talk about culture, it's inherently wrong, in my perspective, to treat any of these things separately. Any borders or any lines that you want to draw are for your own comfort. They're not real. So what you're talking about is that people tend to, communities, societies, villages, they exist within a certain cosmology. And things fit into this cosmology in several ways. When you're talking about folk magic, for instance, it is, again, my perspective, inherently wrong to describe practices which the practitioners themselves would not call magic, you calling them magic. That's unfair. Because most often, when you're talking about curandeiras or saludadoras, they do not consider what they do to be a form of magic. It's an integrating part of their lived religion. You cannot separate this. You cannot impose that definition on them, because that will create a biased view on the understanding of the practices that they do. And the most important part here, when you're talking about a religion as old as Catholicism, and I'm talking about Catholicism in particular, not Christianity.
Understood.
Catholicism, more than a human institution, which is centered in Rome and has a physical leader, which is the Pope, more than that, Catholicism is a cosmology. It's not an institution. Within that cosmology, there exists something called the Church. But the Church, and even this Church itself, is divided, according to Catholic cosmology, into three bodies: Church Triumphant, Church Suffering, and Church Militant. Church Militant is the Church on Earth, which is an immensely small part of the entire cosmology. And folks who will be raised Catholic go to church and respect the priest. Living in this cosmology do have the notions that there are other things outside of this, and doing these other things that do not exist within the church, or that even the church itself might not like, does not make them any less Catholic, because they are still living it within that Catholic cosmology. Within their own narratives, within their own societies and cultures, they are Catholics. Now, obviously, these, when you're talking about this broad sense of Catholic cosmology, you can pretty much fit anything into it. I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore.
Well, I think you make a very valid point, and I like the way you're describing it. And the reason I say that is because having remembered, and she is my best example, my grandmother, having remembered my grandmother was a very devout Catholic woman, but her life was full of magic.
Right. Look, we call it magic. She might even call magic some of the things she did, but we like to call these things magic because these have all contemporarily have this significance that makes it easier for us to apprehend what we're talking about. But yeah, but I get what you're saying completely. Yes.
And it is, I think, I like to say it's a little bit old world, because I think in the modern world, and in the difference being, I grew up in America, and in my area, like I said, there is a lot of a very, very large Portuguese population, most of which are first generation or new. So it is a lot of the old world came to the new world, which was nice. Because it was wonderful to grow up that way. But when you get into when you get out of your little zone, which is what happened with me when I went into areas that didn't have such a concentrated population, and I'm learning how other people learned and grew up and everything, and then I realized that some kids didn't have to rub a gold coin on their eye, and some and somebody else, when they got cherry cough drops instead of that dirt tea my grandmother used to make, and but everybody had a different way. And I think that you brought up something earlier when you said when people aren't familiar with something, they tend to want to either demonize it or label it as unfamiliar and outside of their realm, even though it can coexist within.
Right. And the ironic part here is that even the process of which the Christians like to do, of demonization, is a form of integrating a particular practice within their cosmology. They're attributing it a place within the universe as they know it, but it's simply a place which they consider negative. But in doing so, they actually validate it.
It would make sense, because sometimes when people say, oh, well, but a lot of people look at the Inquisition, and which is a fascinating, terrifying, and often misquoted era of history, I think, because I think a lot of people who are familiar with it outside of, let's say, Monty Python, people who are familiar with it, they're remembering, I think, more Hollywood than history book sometimes when they think about the Inquisition. But when you go into it, it certainly, inarguably, is a very dark time in history. And I think it's a misnomer to label it the quote unquote Spanish Inquisition, because it wasn't confined just to that area. It was, throughout Europe, as my understanding. Right. Yeah, it was.
Right. There were even Protestant Inquisitions that people don't like to talk about, because the Inquisition has been used, maybe rightfully so, to denigrate Southern European Catholic countries, this rivalry, Protestant North and Catholic South. But people forget that Protestant countries had very brutal inquisitions.
Oh, yeah.
Often even more brutal than Catholic countries did.
Well, in the 1600s here in the United States, it was the puritanical witch hunts that were most famously in Salem, but were in other areas, that resulted in some horrific historical notes that are just unfair and wrong. And but when we think about like that time in history, the press was to convert, and anyone who fell outside of what their box was subject to further inquiry. And some say if you had, there was a hysteria to it, I think.
It's not so much when you're talking about 15th century onward, even 12th century onward, you're not really talking about converting anymore. It's about maintaining a particular status quo. Maintaining a certain sense of purity, of perceived purity within society.
So it was more socioeconomic than religious?
Those things weren't separate. There was issues, particularly like if I'm focusing on the Portuguese Inquisition, which is what I study. When I say I study Portuguese magic, it's all about, I'm digging in the archives of the Inquisition. The main preoccupation was the top preoccupation, Jews.
Right.
This was the big problem. There are other issues involved, like some of which are still in existence today. Actually, the issue of blood purity. It was not only Jews were not only a danger in terms of morality, in terms of heresy, because they had a religious practice which was no longer cosmologically valid, but they were taken to be race was not an issue there. That's an anachronism to call it a different race, but they had a stain of blood. So there was also a racial issue involved. And
I don't think people talk enough about the peril of the Jewish people during these times. I think people assign that to a later time in history, and to like, Nazi Germany, when they realized these types of things, unfortunately and horrifically, were going on much earlier.
Nazi Germany, the anti-Semitic narratives of Nazi Germany and contemporary, and the contemporary ones are a direct continuation of a construction of anti-Semitism that is done throughout the medieval age and the early modern period. And you even have clear continuities between these stories that people were constructing about Jews, even today, in stuff in America like Pizzagate or the adrenochrome stories of QAnon. It's a continuation of what's called the blood libel, which was this conspiracy theory that Jews were killing little children and using their blood in rituals. It's ongoing. It never. Anti-Semitism isn't a new thing. Unfortunately, as a historian, I'm forced to say it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon.
Well, I think the best any of us can do is not be part of it, but
yeah, we have to study it, understand it, and learn to just navigate the best we can,
and not be part of it, for sure. Yes,
but just to get back to your point,
yes,
one of the things, which is one of the ways you can look at the Portuguese Inquisition, and in part the Spanish too, there was a religious focus on Judaism and Jews as somebody that was righteous to persecute, but you can look at it from an economic perspective, because the Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, was financially independent from the crown. They were self-funded, and the way they received funding was by selling the stuff they apprehended from the people they arrested. Curiously, many rich businessmen and rich doctors and rich everything were Jews. So it was a win-win situation. You made the priests happy because we're burning some Jews, but then the Inquisition would be able to finance itself in this like everlasting
from the spoils of the murder.
Yeah, with the spoils. So we need to constantly be persecuting Jews so that we can finance ourselves, so we can persecute more Jews.
That's diabolical.
It's awful. Yeah, it's horrible.
But it's they'd say there's nothing new under the sun, and just a few couple of centuries later, in the Salem, Massachusetts persecution, the witch trials, those worked very similarly, in the sense that if someone was accused, they had to pay for their own incarceration while they awaited trial, and often it used up all of their means, because we're talking a meager Puritan settlement in comparison to something that's been around for centuries. This is really, we're only in the first century that these people have been settling here, so that we don't have all the established societal cities and stuff. So what happens is that you're in jail and you go into debt, and they have to sell off your land. Your land gets seized. Yeah. And just as you said, so it's basically accusation, seize of assets, and then there's a benefit for those who are either part of the machine of accusation or doing the accusing. A lot of time neighbor would accuse neighbor in order to maybe rebuy that piece of land that maybe touches theirs for a cheaper price once it's been foreclosed on and after they've been indebted. Yeah. It's the same. It's just no nice way to say it. It's the same ugly bullshit.
The closest thing that Portugal ever got to a witch hunt which there was no witch hunt in Portugal because the Inquisition didn't care about what you would call witches. But the closest period you had to that was the 18th century, which was pretty late already. And what was happening in those days was that as the Enlightenment was taking hold in Portugal and you had more educated medics and doctors and people graduating in universities, it was these recently graduated physicians that would accuse folk practitioners of magic and illicit practices, not so much because they actually cared about what they were doing, but they were competition.
Right. Again, economics plays in.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, because the herbal medicine from, and the way my mother would tell me a little bit, and the way they would describe it is that, you know, of course, the Portuguese were the explorers of the world, the grand navigators.
One of, yes.
To say that we got around is fair.
Very fair, yes.
So, you know, which is one of the reasons I say when you look at the, like, let's say something as simple as the spices in Portuguese food are going to reflect the travels and that, you know, what has been brought to the country and what was integrated into the diet and all that good stuff. And so, you know, there's a lot of medicine that probably was gained from traveling to China. Which I think we can all, you know, agree has a beautiful tradition that's very long-standing of herbal medicine, and other cultures and civilizations around the world that could be visited upon, where things could be brought back and then integrated into the culture. So, you know, I've always thought that herbal medicines and folk magic, if you will, was all part of it. It was just like you said, it's all integrated into the cosmology of what are the people.
Yeah. Even if you can consider that folk magic, the let's call it the making of herbs and teas, which is something that people have done all, you know, as long as there's people have been boiling herbs.
Sure.
But these practices that exist within these cultures in a place like Portugal, they weren't hermetically separated from anything else. So you do have these overlaps. When stuff becomes more available, people will adopt this new herb or this new thing, whether it is that because they heard somewhere that a doctor was using it, or because they just looked at it and thought that it looked like it might solve something. You know, these things get integrated. Sure, yeah.
Which brings me back to some of the rituals in the book. Now, in these writings, and why are people so afraid of this book? Because I mean, in modern times, I've talked to people about this book, and they kind of wince. There is a mystique and a fear surrounding the book.
I was also, the first time I heard about the book was in the 90s somewhere. I was a kid, 91, 92. I was in primary school, I think. Anyway, the first time I heard about it, it was described to me as a scary book, as a dangerous, evil book by my grandmother. In the meantime, I think this has died down a bit. I've unfortunately met people not that much younger than me who don't even know what the Book of St. Cyprian is, which to me is inconceivable.
Right.
And now, the origin of this fear, I'm not sure where it came from. Look, you have these reports, like I said, 16th century, 17th, 18th century people talking about books of St. Cyprian. There doesn't seem to be any greater fear of this book than there would be of any other book, any other magic book. You find Keys of Solomon, which are, frankly, if you're looking at it from a religious perspective, the Key of Solomon is infinitely more sinister than the Book of St. Cyprian, which is a collection of prayers and medicines. Come on.
Right.
There isn't a fear factor there. The only time I see that this becomes relevant, becomes an intrinsic part of the not so much as an intrinsic part of the book itself, but of the idea of the book in Portuguese culture, I believe was during the Portuguese dictatorship of the 20th century. I have found in the National Archives because the book was censored. It was
forbidden.
Prohibited.
Yes, I do remember hearing about that.
It was forbidden, and I found the censorship order. It's dated from 1930 something, shortly after Salazar rose to power, a few years later. And I think it was genuinely during that time period, which was an extended time period. It was 40 something years. It was from 28 to 74. During that time period, I think it's when this visceral, irrational fear of this book became a reality, was implemented somehow. I'm not sure how, but like I said before that, I don't see it. I genuinely don't see it.
I've studied this, so I mean, you know, you're coming from a place of where you've talked to people about this, you've read up on this. That's fairly where it starts.
Yeah, there's the first, what you might call the first academic paper on the Book of St Cyprian that gets written. It's from 1888. There is no mention of this looming horror and fear, nothing. The guy, I mean, it's 1888, you can't expect him to be to exercise methodological agnosticism as a contemporary scholar is supposed to. He really bashes the book. He's a positivist. He believes in progress. So to him, the book is, it's not so much fear. He loathes the book because of the superstitious nature of it. But he doesn't mention people being afraid of it. He doesn't mention anything of this sort. He just makes fun of it.
It's like old-fashioned foolishness.
Yes, this quaint foolishness of the undereducated. So there is nothing there, and then shortly after there's the dictatorship, which is a very heavily conservative Catholic dictatorship. The book gets censored, and everybody acquires an irrational fear of it. I assume it's the dictatorship somewhere.
That's an interesting, because I've always wondered why. Because what I've read of the book, and you know, like I think I don't want to say, it's just like you said, it's sort of just kind of quaint. A lot of it is very old world. It's very quaint. It's, you know, ritualistic. It's some of them. I think I remember something with an owl. You know, it's some of it's fantastic in the book. I remember something about a black owl, and I remember it was an owl because I had to look up the word because I didn't know the word owl in Portuguese.
Oh, we have two. It's complicated. It's either mocho or coruja. Yes,
coruja. I didn't know what. I'm like, what is that? And I know it was a coruja preta, and I know I said it's a black owl.
Yeah,
correct. To myself, how do you find a black owl? I can't find a regular owl. You know, I'm not good at finding owls, but you know, and some of it is I actually thought, from what I was able to glean from it, that it was quaint, and it was also very colorful in the sense that it was very fantastical in some areas, that it was, you know, it was almost like romantically fantastic in some of the rituals.
It is. The book as we have today, the 19th century version, is it can be a fun read.
It really was. It is.
There's nothing in there that's particularly scary. I remember the first time I read it, the only scary thing about it was the cultural baggage, because the book itself is not scary. There's some genuinely silly things there. There's a supposed like love sorcery that a woman is supposed to do to a man. It basically gets down to you know, bathe yourself, look nice, and cook the man a meal. That's it.
You know, that works though.
Yeah.
I can tell you that works, but you have to add wine. You got to add wine. But it's, you know, that's what I'm saying. I found it very, you know, fantastical, romantic, and quaint. And I was floored by how many people were expressing, you know, horror and dread at the thought of it. And like you said, there were so many other texts that I think are much more I would say, I don't want to say diabolical because that sounds judgmental, but there are texts that are much more specific on darker
much
magic.
more explicitly diabolical, let's say. No,
Yes, the rituals to actually commune with demons and et cetera, et cetera. Whether one believes that that's possible is not up to me. But the thing is that those texts do exist and they have existed for centuries. And for some reason, you know, looking for owls and making a meal for a man has gone into this demonic phase. So it's very interesting that it translates to the political.
Yeah, look, that's my only explanation. Like I said, I can't tell you how this happened. I just know that there was a period in time where it wasn't there, then it was, and what happened in the middle, a dictatorship. So exclusion of parts, I think that's the culprit. But I don't know the mechanism, how this got done, if it was orchestrated or not. Because there were people during that period doing what you might call social engineering on a large scale. The way that contemporary Portuguese see themselves is still a construction of the Estado Novo. We still need therapy. We're not done with that. They haven't gone away. Sure, we have a better political system, but the things that they placed inside our heads are still here.
It's a legacy.
Yeah, and about that thing with the fear. Look, I gave a lecture once in the University of Porto, so a university in a great cosmopolitan city. Some people will argue that Porto is more cosmopolitan than Lisbon. I personally don't think so, but some people will argue this. And I was invited to give a lecture on the Book of St Cyprian. It was these open lectures that everybody could attend. People are very excited because those lectures are usually the room gets filled, and there was no one there. And the organizer approached me and told me that people had approached her and saying that they weren't going to show up because they were scared. In a university, in a faculty of humanities, there are people in a faculty of humanities that are afraid of arrangements of paper and ink, which is what that book is. It's paper and ink.
Right.
So I can't explain it. Sometimes I need to look at it and appreciate it from an academic perspective. This is a cultural object that I can look at and analyze. But sometimes it gets to me. It's inadmissible that in a university, people will be afraid to discuss a book.
That is far-fetched. I got to agree with you on that. So if folks want to read the book and read it in English, they can go to Amazon and again look up José Leitão. There's going to be some live links in the description of the podcast, so you can just click and go right to your page. And there's also going to be a live link to your YouTube channel. And the Coimbra Book of St Cyprian is a translation that they can read.
Well, you gave a list of books. They're not. I have more than those, actually.
Yes, there's plenty.
So the 19th century contemporary book. If today you walk into a Portuguese bookstore and you ask for the Book of St Cyprian, the one you get is not that one.
Oh, okay.
But I've also translated that one. That's just called the Book of St Cyprian. The Book of St Cyprian, the Sorcerer's Treasure. That should be available on Amazon. It's a really old translation. I did it over 10 years ago. At the time, I wasn't a scholar yet. I was an amateur.
We're all works in progress.
Yeah, but I was taking a PhD in physics at the time, so I decided to do a translation of a magic book because that makes sense.
I have to say I admire what I always have I folks that listen in have heard me call it the Da Vinci brain, is when you have both sides of your brain going on. So you have one side where you are delving into this historical folk magic area, and the other side you have a PhD in physics.
Yes.
That's a lot. That's a lot. That's definitely science and physics and metaphysics meeting.
Well, technically, I suppose. Although I don't look at it so much that way. At the time, look, this is my point. When I did that translation originally, I was unsure what I was doing. I was bored, essentially. And so the translation, I stand by the translation of the book itself. Then I wrote an introduction to it and some comments. Some of the comments I wasn't sure what I was doing. I didn't know that it was possible to have a sober historical approach to these topics. So I ramble on, and it's fine. Look, it's not an academic book. It's not supposed to
Right.
be this cold thing. That what I wrote then. That was my personal experience of that book. That's the comments and the introduction. That's a physicist trying to make sense of something that he doesn't know much about, and that's the way it should be looked at. As a, not, I don't call that an academic book. That's a very human book to me. So,
Well,
but if you want
we're
just
all
the
human.
basic, if you just want the basic 19th century book, that's the one. Then I have another work which is called the Opuscula Cipriani, which is a very, very large book. I cannot, in good conscience, advise people to buy it because it's very large and expensive. That is a compilation of various versions of the Book of St. Cyprian, some of them from the 19th century, some of them previous to that, and some after the 19th century book gets created. You have all different variations of this book. So I compiled all that material from archives and libraries. And it was a huge amount of work, but it's a compilation of everything I knew at that time about the Book of St. Cyprian. It's there. In the meantime, I've picked up a couple more things, but that's different. And one of the things that is inside that Opuscula Cipriani is a particular manuscript that I found in the University Library of Coimbra, which is the oldest version of the Book of St. Cyprian known contemporarily. It's a treasure hunting book from the 18th century. And then I published that as a standalone book and called it the Coimbra Book of St. Cyprian. So
Amazing.
technically, I have published 3 Cyprian books: the 19th century one, a large compilation, and the Coimbra book.
The history nerd in me has to ask, when you found the manuscript, that must have been amazing to actually see it.
Yes.
That has to be. It must be like seeing the
It's
Mona Lisa or seeing something,
I look, everybody. It's obviously manuscripts were supposed to exist. I wasn't expecting to find one. At the time, I was collecting prayers of Saint Cyprian, and the library catalog just said called the book a collection of various prayers to drive away the devil. That's how the book was called, and then it had a small note saying it contains the prayer of Saint Cyprian. Okay, cool, fine. I collect these prayers. Let me check this out. And then they bring out this tiny thing, like 30 folios long, just a small tiny book. And I just started going through it, and indeed the prayer of Saint Cyprian was there, but it wasn't isolated. It wasn't a collection of prayers. It was a continuous text from the whole thing, and it kept using the prayer of the prayer of Saint Cyprian didn't show up one time. It was all over the book.
Oh wow.
And it's hard to explain all the things that go through your head when you're doing that, because you start comparing it with other things other books that you've read, other reports, Inquisition trials, and try to make sense of what's going on there. But I assume it would be the feeling of it would be the same as one of those Bigfoot hunters actually finding Bigfoot. It's not supposed to be there. You know it might exist. There's evidence of it, but you're not expecting actually to find it. But then you do.
That had to have been a great day.
It was a very weird day. I'll call it weird because
I bet it was. That's awesome. That's fantastic. It always pains me to think anything like this stays hidden. So I love that it's out and being discussed and people can read it and read about it. And thank you for all that you've done. And it's a lot on the subject. And again, folks can go to Amazon, and again, there's a live link and look up José Leitão, and also a YouTube channel, and you can hear a little bit more about it there. I can't thank you enough for talking with us today, because it's been wonderful. I'm sure my vovô would be very, very proud.
Okay. Look, thanks for the invitation. It's been a while since I've done anyone's podcast.
Well, it's been terrific. Now, I think one thing I have one last question. Is there a heavy metal, death metal band in Portugal named Cyprian? If not, there needs to be.
I don't think so.
I think
There are
you
a
need one.
few Brazilian bands that have music about Cyprian. There might be one or two that make a
Sepultura
reference
does.
to it. What?
Sepultura, I think, in Imaginage. Might.
Maybe, but no, not in Portugal. Oh, and there's a historical reason for that. We're, like I said, we're still weaning from the dictatorship, and immediately in the revolution of '74, there was this thing that happened. You know, we had a very unhealthy left-wing government immediately, which is normal. You tend to shift to radical,
Right.
and then it balances out. But the initial impact was heavy left-wing stuff, which constructed an idea of itself as explicitly opposed to the previous power structure. So if the previous power structure glorified Portuguese things, items, ideas, even if they were fabricated from within the system, they glorified them. The new power structure vilified anything Portuguese. So you had this period where even Portuguese music was hard to find on the radio or anywhere, which created this. Then we had all this influx of American and European musical styles and cultures and all this, and not much of it has still been reintegrated genuinely into Portuguese culture. We are still suffering from that break of vilifying certain aspects of Portugueseness and then importing new models, and the two haven't really communicated. So our heavy metal bands tend to sing in English.
They do.
And
Yep.
they tend to focus on, some of them even have occult thematics, but it's Anglo-American occultism, like Thelema or Aleister Crowley or something like that. So none of them have gone into St Cyprian as far as I know.
I just got to give a shout out to my cousin Ronaldo and his band Sacrilegium. So but once again, thank you so much. And folks can find your books at the live links, and there's more information. You can always get in touch with us. It is wonderful to speak with you. And for all you folks out there, just remember, you can read this book and nothing scary will happen to you. And thanks so much for listening, and stay kooky out there. Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartsstudio.com.